Pe'ahi is the Hawaiian name for it. And Pe'ahi means the beacon or to be called. And it's true. It's called people from around the world. It's called us.
It really did feel like we were watching the Avengers and these were our superheroes.
I thought he was a god.
The wave has aura unlike any other wave.
It is Jaws to me because it is one of the gnarliest waves on Earth.
I had a little off. Yeah, I had to cut a bill off. Yeah, but if we be real though.
I feel like this conversation about Jaws is going to be our best one yet, but there's so much to talk about because we have such a long history with the place, even before we even surfed it. And so, yeah, this might be part 1 of part 5.
Yeah, I think a good place to start would be what was your first memory of that particular wave growing up?
Well, I just remember one of my earliest memories was going down to the cliff with mom and dad. And I think you might have been, too young to remember, but I just remember being on the cliff and we played, hooky from school. And I mean, the cool thing about Maui, especially when we were growing up, is if there was a really big swell, it was the equivalent to a snow day. Like the teachers wanted you to be able to go watch these magnificently large waves break. And so we got to do that. And one of my best friends growing up, Cody Kerbox, his dad was Buzzy Kerbox, one of the pioneers and legends of tow and surfing and Jaws. And so when we'd play hooky, it would be with Cody. Either his mom would take us or my dad or, our mom was working at Kaiser at the time as a doctor. So she was pretty busy. But anyway, I just remember being up there and looking down and studying that wave so much and understanding it. I think I nearly felt like I knew it better than most people riding it because there was such a time spent, studying the place.
Yeah, and when you started surfing it too, I feel like I was on the cliff for many years and I felt the same way. Like every empty wave that would come through, I would just be imagining what line I would take or how I would get in the barrel. And I was just always just so shocked at how many barrels come through that place and how little people get barreled out there. So that was like my number one thing growing up. It was like, I have to figure out how to get inside a barrel and just mind surfing it all day. And it was definitely easier to mind surf it. But I think one of my earliest memories ever was when you, Cody, and I were watching, I think it was around like 2002 or something. And we were like in the tree there. We'd like climb the tree and like watch the waves. And I just remember not really like focusing that much on the waves and then just looking up and seeing this wave just blowing its guts out. And then a guy with a red vest just comes flying out of the barrel with his arms up. Mm-hmm. And that was that GMAC wave that like gave him a career. It was probably still one of the best barrels ever ridden. That was literally one of my first memories ever, was seeing him get blown out of that thing.
Yeah, Garrett McNamara. That day, I think that was right around like, the Strapped crew had been doing their thing since 92, tow and surfing out there. And it was around, I think 2002 is when there was a lot of momentum from other people besides this, small group that was challenging Jaws. And Garrett McNamara was one of the guys that came over from Oahu. And he was a very prolific big wave surfer up to that point with paddling Waimea Bay and all the tow and surfing on the outer reefs. And I mean, at that time, so much exploration still. And I mean, there was definitely barrels being ridden at Jaws by the Strapped crew, but I think this one in particular was borderline an accident because it was at a time where they just really started to use impact vests or flotation devices because they realized that this wave was so powerful it'd hold you down, and without a flotation device, you're likely to get 3-wave hold down there because it's just pulling water so down. There's basically veins in the reef, and the current of that wave is just doing like basically it's almost like there's ropes under there and it's just grabbing your ankles and it's just trying to pull you down, and you need that vest to come up. So long story short, everyone was very tentative about taking it to the absolute limit. GMAC wasn't. Well, I think that wave in particular was a mistake in a way, but it was something that once you're committed to taking a line on that big of a wave, you have no choice. You got to pull in. You're going to either fall going straight or you're going to fall pulling in. So you might as well kind of go for it and not think about the consequences. But it was Dane Kealoha, legendary surfer, probably one of the best surfers of his era to never win a world title. Probably deserved to win a world title. I think it was pretty political back then with judging and all that. But he was, a legend surfer from the North Shore of Oahu, king of backdoor. He was on, back then they had like the jet skis that I think were 700 cc's. So I don't know, the thing probably was like 80 horsepower. Basically, what did they call them? The turtles, or what was the other name they had for it?
Oh, like the hamster or something like that.
Yeah, the hamster, because they kind of looked like hamsters. And everyone had already evolved a little bit, but they were towing in on that. And Dane, so highly respected, he basically, I think Garrett was sitting in the channel on a boat just longing to get a wave. And then Dane pulled up and he said, hop on. And they basically just went straight out the back, did a lap, towed into this super west peak. And Jaws in particular, the best single ridden waves are usually the northwest sets because they come just straight down the reef. You can get barreled on them, but they're just this perfect peeling wall, basically giant Velziland. The one he got towed into was more out of the west, so it was basically just backdoor pipeline, just on a huge scale. And I think everyone backed off because of who Dane was driving him, and G-Mac, he got just towed in too deep, basically. He got towed in where you would go for a northwest wave, 325, and it was a 300 and maybe 9-degree wave. So it was coming in way more out of the west. And he let go where you would normally let go for these other waves. Because it's still new territory for these guys. And sure enough, he did the perfect line. Went to the bottom, G'd out his bottom turn, probably pulled a couple of G's and pulled up under. And the best photo I ever saw from that single wave, I think the best Jaws photo of all time, is probably Ron Dahlquist. Shot from the water, the one I'm talking about, Ridge?
Where he's just like
in the barrel mist. And the shockwaves like just hitting, like about to hit him, and G-Mac is just right there, and still one of the most legendary moments ever. But that was that wave, and then the way he kicked out too, right, where he like put his hands up and like put it on his head, and there was just this giant second wave behind. It was just like, I don't know, as a kid, were we in Lord of the Rings? Were we in Star Wars? It was its own thing. It's like this fantasy movie that we got to experience first in person, and then second when you watch the clips come out, like in Riding Giants and Step into Liquid, those legendary films from back in the day. It was just, that's like, what it's, I want to capture that magic and somehow try to share it with people, because what we got to grow up in, like nowadays, it feels unreal. Like it was just, it deserved to be in a fantasy world like the Lord of the Rings or something.
Yeah, that's the thing I feel like that we take for granted a little bit nowadays, now that Jaws has been ridden for 30 years. And I think a lot of people are really desensitized to that wave. But when we were growing up, like late 90s, early 2000s, they were just figuring it out. Like this wave was on such another level from every other big wave on the world. It was way bigger, way more hollow. And we were like literally witnessing these guys take this thing on. And every time a new movie would come out, like, because there was obviously no social media, you would just be like, oh my gosh, this is insane. And it really did feel like we were watching like the Avengers, and these were our superheroes. But at the same time, you'd go to Anthony's Coffee in the morning and they were just right there. And it was just such a crazy way for us to grow up, because they were our Spider-Man, they were our Iron Man, but like we can go and talk to them. It was pretty cool.
Yeah, they were the equivalent to the Justice League. And I mean, just when I was back in France, and we talked about this the last episode, how everyone, there's just so much energy around surfing. There's so much passion on the beach. There's thousands of people that are like there for Kelly Slater. And there's just like this energy, and that energy existed on Maui at one point. It doesn't feel like it exists much anymore. I mean, there's passionate people, of course, that are, creating the equipment, or they're in fact, like just living the dream. But there's not that same hype. But like in the mornings, if my dad or our dad would wake up at 5:30 in the morning, and we'd get up pretty early too, and he would drag us to, not really drag us, but we'd go to Anthony's coffee shop, which was right in our local town, Paia, 5 minutes away from our house. And at any given point, you could walk in there and Laird Hamilton, David Kalama, Derek Dorner, Buzzy Kerbox, like the best of the best, the guys that were creating big wave surfing out at Peahi Jaws, they were there. And then in the evenings, this includes all the other water sports too. Like there was this wall of fame of all the best surfers and windsurfers and kiters, and they'd be on that wall. Remember Jacques Ridge? And they'd always have all the strapped movies playing in the back on the TVs by the sushi bar. And you could just look across the room and being like a 10-year-old kid and just see like the legends. And they were there most nights, like every other night. They was just the craziest time. Sick. Like, but yeah, it's just, it was wild.
It was almost like it's similar to like when we go to Nazare, it has that sort of similar hype. But I think the difference was back then, like just without having the inflation vests, the jet skis were bad. Like you had to be really gnarly to go out there. Like you have to be the best waterman on earth to go. So there was that hype, but it was like these really small group of elite guys that seemed so much larger than life. And that literally seemed like superheroes. It wasn't like nowadays, I look at myself, I'm like, okay, I'm kind of a normal dude and I go and surf these waves. Like these guys were different, they were cut from some sort of different cloth and they had to be like that to go out there because they didn't really know what would happen if you took a really nuts wipeout out there. If you got a 2-3 wave hold down, it was all sort of unexplored territory. And yeah, it was pretty sick growing up and being able to see them. I remember one time Laird was renting a place on our street. And we were so like worked up about it. We were so starstruck, and our dad like convinced us, go just knock on the door and say what up. And we're like, oh crap, okay, let's go knock on Laird's door. And we did. And he like opened the door, and we just kind of stared at him blankly as we were like pretty starstruck because we were just watching his movie on our TV for the 800th time. And then he just kind of looked at us, and then I think like he might have said something and then just closed the door, and then we went home. It was pretty funny.
Such a Grom thing to do. That was pretty sick. Yeah, we were definitely enamored. I think also the benefit, no social media, the only thing you had was your 5 DVDs that one would come out per year or every other year, and it was actually VHS really at that time, and it was I think that's why it was such a special time because people were really living in the moment and there was a focus on your surroundings. And if you were here, if you wanted to be someone in the water sports world and big wave surfing at that time, you had to come to Maui, you had to go surf Jaws, or you had to be at Hokipa, you had to do something like that. And there was like, the only way to experience it is you couldn't do it through this device. You had to be there in person to see it. Even if you weren't necessarily participating, in order to see it, you just had to be on the ground. And I thought that was like what made it so special. Whereas now there's so much distractions and people are living their own personal lives in such unique and different ways. And that's totally cool too. But the camaraderie, or the community of people in a single sport or in multiple sports, like it just, I think you only see that nowadays in maybe like, American football, soccer, worldwide football, these kind of more mainstream sports. But in the action sports world, it feels like it even became more individualistic. Like it wasn't as much, I don't know, hanging out. I don't know. It's just times change. But I have some DVDs that we should just show everyone. Maybe you can YouTube them.
The first movie they came out with was called Wake Up Call, right? And that's when
one's on YouTube.
I'll show some clips right now, but that's where they sort of exposed Jaws. Like Jaws had never been like seen other than people that were there in person. And this was the wave that this was the movie that kind of blew it all open. And how many times did we watch that as a kid? That was like, it was called Wake Up Call because it literally was like a message to the surf and water sports world that like just exploded everything. They were using strap boards, doing flips at Hokipa, windsurfing, kiting, doing all these crazy things, and then surfing the new biggest wave in the world. It was pretty sick. And I still go on YouTube and watch that movie pretty much once a year.
They stacked so many clips of just every single day it broke in the 90s, or for I think a couple of years before they put out this thing. And I often think, how big would those guys have been if if social media was during that era and they had done something so profound and crazy like that. I mean, Laird ended up becoming, one of the most famous, recognizable surfers on the face of the planet. But, I think a lot of the other guys in the Strapped crew, and we should go through who was on the Strapped crew, it was Rush Randall, Dave Kalama, Derek Dorner, Buzzy Kerbox, Mark Angulo, Brett Lickle. Who else was, let me see. I don't want to miss anyone. Mike Waltz was on it. Pete Cabrina. Those are, and then I think Jerry Lopez was like, he was shaping everyone's boards and he was kind of like the godfather of it all. Watch these clips of Wake Up Call, but the clips are absolutely insane. And it was all to like the craziest music too. They had Jimi Hendrix, they had the Foo Fighters, they had, they might have had Nirvana on there too, but the video was just absolutely crazy. I think we killed that Wake Up Call cassette. It just ran out, just wore out. But thank goodness someone uploaded it to YouTube, because I have it downloaded on my iPad for when I'm on the plane and I'm feeling some nostalgic motivation. Bingo. So I think, which one of all the movies, Ridge, what was your favorite besides Wake Up Call?
Let me think. I think Strapped was sort of the pinnacle of what those guys were doing. It was like the whole crew. It wasn't just Laird or just one of them. And it was all their gnarliest clips. It was when I think they really started riding big Jaws days. I think at the start in the 90s, it was like, okay, gonna work up to it. And then Strapped was kind of the culmination of what that whole crew represented. And sort of after that, I feel like it did, that Strapped crew bond sort of, as it became more publicized and became more of a mainstream type of thing, I think it kind of got fractured in certain ways.
Yeah,
but for me, nostalgia wise, it was like
heavy hitters.
Yeah. And I remember we each had our favorite guy. Like I was obsessed with Rush Randall when I was a kid. And I think you were kind of a Laird and Dave type of guy, but it was a pretty cool times. It truly was the Justice League. Cause you have, Pete Cabrina, an insane windsurfer, one of the best windsurfers at the time.
He was like Rush the first Randall, guy to really do front flips on a surfboard too.
Yeah. Pete. Yeah. And then Rush Randall, I think, was a guy is the most underrated surfer of all time, I think.
For sure.
And if you look at
25 years, he was 25 years ahead of his time. I mean, I feel like with our strap surfing, we're just catching up to what was doing 25 years ago. And he was too early with foiling. He was literally like the god at foil tricks. He could do 3 backflips in a row, like on a single wave, just bouncing. And oh my gosh, it's just crazy.
But yeah, his clips at Hokipo where he's riding a strap, where he's riding like an old school, like 6'4", super narrow, and just has straps on it. And he's doing backflip 360s. Like we're still trying to dial in some of these tricks he was doing in the 90s, which is just insane.
Guy's so good. I mean, all of those guys in their own way. I think that's what made the crew so cool. Like the Justice League, or these, most kids, I guess nowadays, they grow up with fictional characters as their heroes. And, there's of course like sporting heroes, but like this was like a group of individuals that were so different and brought something to the table that was unique. It was Laird's bravado and big wave skill and fearlessness that I think helped lead the crew into this uncharted territory. I think it was, Dave Kalama, his ability to, put together things from windsurfing into big waves, and kind of, he was like, I would say in between maybe how crazy Rush was in the air to how hardcore Laird was at big waves. He kind of was in the middle there. And then Derek Dorner brought the life-saving safety aspect from being, an incredible lifeguard on the North Shore of Oahu, a legend before even stepping foot into it. And then I think with the guidance of Jerry Lopez showing Laird and showing these guys this spot back in the 80s, and, he'd been looking at this wave, I think might have been in the late 60s, early 70s. And there's a cool story to that. We'll get to that in a minute. But, just to kind of like name these figures, and then you had, Pete Cabrina, who is an incredible surfer and also windsurfer, innovating the air stuff similar to Rush. And And then I think you had someone, completely different, which was Brett Lickle, who, if you asked him, he wouldn't consider himself the greatest athlete there is, but he was always an inventor and a creator of ideas. And he had these guys as sort of being test pilots for him. And so he might have an idea while these guys are focused on performances on the wave, he could help facilitate that. And he was still part of it. And we got to show the clip of Brett breaking both his legs out at. We would repeat this clip 150 times in one sitting
gnarly.
Because the mixture between the songs, and this was the benefit. These movies are straight cinematic. It's not like a normal surf movie
good.
where it's just music and raw. They had like sound design. They had like storytelling. They had the most crazy interviews. And I don't even know if I could still replicate the level of cinema that these were created. Like the drama, like it was genius because we now know you can survive Jaws pretty much in any size. I mean, things can happen. It's a deadly spot, but no one actually died, right? But back then, they made you convinced that if you fall, you will die. And their motto was, just don't fall. And then it's just Brett packing this barrel, and they hit what he calls a phantom chop, and his legs extend, and then he lands, and the rail digs in, and both his legs snap because his board turns this way, and his body turns the opposite. And then he's laying on the sled, and the whole strap crew's around him, making sure he's good. And oh my gosh, we got to watch this. I have a DVD player behind me. I have to watch this.
Yeah, it's hopefully I could find that clip on YouTube. Maybe we'll have to.
Well, we
get
could
it
always
off the...
maybe rip it off this. I got the clip
Yeah.
right here.
Oh, sick. Yeah.
So
no,
there's you answer this is your favorite. I'd probably say that too, but I would say in my era of Laird fandom, it was Laird. That was the one that for me, because in this film, Laird hardly says a word, but he's literally portrayed as a god. And when you're a young and impressionable kid, I thought he was a god, like 100%.
Literally.
If in the Justice League, he would have been the Superman of the crew, like, whereas maybe Rush would have been Batman or something. I don't know. Like, it's funny. But anyway, the Laird movie is just so sick. I still could watch it today. And, he was just tearing apart Jaws. And this was like just him riding. The strap crew was rad because it kind of had everyone. And they were still getting film angles with the helicopter, and they were always shooting 16 mil, even up to 35. So the footage looks better than most of the clips I've ever gotten out at Jaws.
We've tried to replicate, how do we get that look back? And it's, you have to almost have film.
Need film. They had the best cinematographers with them. They had legendary Don King, who's shot many pictures in water. He was like one of the best water cinematographers. Mike Prickett's similar. He's worked on all these massive, any Hollywood production that comes to Oahu or Hawaii in general, or even anything water related, he's pretty much contacted. Laird and all those guys were best friends with all these heavy artists. So they always had U2, Ben Harper, Moby, Pearl Jam, like best friends with Eddie Vedder. I mean,
we saw Eddie Vedder and Anthony's one morning with Laird. I think it was pretty cool.
Yeah, no, it was glorious. And then I mean, so to catalog it, it went Wake Up Call, Laird movie, Strapped, The Ride, The Day. Well, these are 2 movies in one. And then, let me see here. Actually, and then for their summertime picture, it was The Waterman Bash. Do you remember that?
Yeah, Namotu.
VHS. They got all, at the time, the best watermen on earth, and they brought him to Namotu. Robbie Nash, one of our heroes, one of my heroes. I would say it was really between Laird and Rush as my figureheads, right? And then you had Pete Cabrina, Rush Randall, Mark Angulo, Francisco Goya, professional world champion windsurfer, Jason Polikow, one of the best wave sailors in the world, Buzzy Kerbox, Maurice Abreu, which was like one of the early kiteboarding freestyle guys, and insane wave kiter, Lou Wayman, who's like maybe the godfather of like wake style kiteboarding. And then there was obviously, a couple more, including Chuck Patterson and those guys. But they went to the island for a week and they just went ham. And it was like sick because the kiting had just been invented, really. Like it was like the second year of its existence. So I don't know. We got to figure out a way to turn this into digital media.
I haven't seen that movie probably in 15 years. We gotta watch it.
But I watched it recently, and it's so sick. It's insane. Mike Waltz did the film, and he just went that in between, and then
they capped it off with All Aboard the Crazy Train, which was their most high budget. Like, this was a cinema movie, and I remember we went to the premiere at the Mac, which is we're lucky enough to have a really nice big theater here that they do concerts, and they premiered this movie there, and it was like weird. It was like a celebrity type of thing. Like, this thing was huge.
Unbelievable. There were celebrities there.
Yeah, it was so hype. Like, the crowd was going crazy every time they dropped into waves. It was probably one of the coolest things ever. Like, it was such a good time.
And it was dramatic too, though. It was super dramatic because it was the Strapped crew had already kind of split up. So this film was really only about Laird, Dave, and Derek. And those were like these guys kind of factioned off to their own little crew. And then, Rush and Pete Cabrina were the other thing. And the funny thing is, when this was filmed, actually Pete Cabrina won and broke the world record for the biggest wave ever ridden on a left at Jaws that Rush towed him into. It was like 70 feet, 72 feet.
Yeah, 71.
It was still by today's standards so big. But this was Laird, Dave, and Derek's perspective, and it was the height of chaos out at Jaws. It was 2004. It was really the turning point. It was the turning point where it was probably the peak of their era in terms of like media attention, being on 60 Minutes, being on National Geographic, like, and everyone had, the circus had come to town, right? There was like 60 jet skis out, and people were there was no etiquette, and it was just chaos, and these guys weren't getting their waves, and to their own doing, really. They were the ones that brought it upon themselves. They could have probably kept it secret for much longer, but they kind of talk about their disappointment on how it just changed from how they used to have it to themselves. And it gave them a career, but at what price?
Yeah, so that was a good story they told, and it was it what you mentioned, it's like kind of their own doing, and that was so the truth. They, with Wake Up Call on, they made the decision that, okay, like, we're going to make a career out of this wave instead of maybe just riding it, which you can't blame them for, but that's what they did. And they put this wave, like, there's kids like us and obviously adults that saw this and are just so mesmerized by it and wanted to go do it. And maybe there was a lot of guys that, maybe Laird and Rush and all those guys made it seem really easy, and it made it comfortable for a lot of people that maybe shouldn't have been out there to go. And that was sort of the story they tell in that movie. It's like, there's just straight, like, to put it bluntly, jabronis out there. And they were just getting cooked on giant waves. Like, there's a few videos on YouTube of guys just getting held down for such absurd amounts of time. Like, it's really lucky, honestly, during those years no one died. Like, it was a bunch
of guys got really, really, really hurt. Like, broken backs, dangling femurs, like, just the works, like, so gnarly.
And just
and a lot of surfers came into it, though, right? Like, not knowing how to put foot straps on boards. And, I still see it to this day. Like, I've had to tell, Lucas out at Nazare, I'm like, dude, I got to teach you how to put foot straps on your board. He's the best guy out at Nazare, and he didn't know how to put foot. It's like, still to this day, they're loose, they're spread. So when you have a foot strap that's spread really wide and really tight, so it's only over your knuckles of your foot, like over the toes a little bit. When it's spread like that, you get really stuck. And then when you have the screws loose this way, so the strap basically is articulating like this, you try to slide your feet out, and it comes with you, and it keeps you locked in. And what we know from windsurfing is you want to have the spread much narrower, around 6-inch spread. Some guys actually prefer 5.5, but I would say 6 to 6.5 inches across, versus some guys are doing 8 or 9 inches, and you want them tall. So you want them to press against the side of your foot and then have a little gap on the top, because when you're in the straps, you turn your foot less than a degree and your foot's locked in. But the moment you point your toes, you slide right out. So you could fall in the most precarious situation and fall out. And, I've, like, back then, surfers not being familiar, being comfortable with straps, they were ending up breaking their ankles. Dan Moore, who broke the record after Pete Cabrina, one of the biggest waves ever ridden out on the right at Jaws. He took off a little too deep and had to straighten out. He broke his back foot because his foot got stuck in. And, you know, it was at a time of innovation and people were learning, and these incredible surfers were trying to figure out this alternative, you know, equipment that was developed basically on Maui. And the Laird and Strapped crew and all these guys had the advantage because they came from not only surfing, but they also were, you know, competing for titles in windsurfing and kiteboarding. And, you know, it's like that. I think that was part of the reason why people were getting so broken off. But it's still, to this day, people still put on straps, and I look at them, I'm like, I hope you don't break your ankles or you blow your knee out.
And those 2004, 2005, that was before obviously you or I were out there. So I always like asking. Before. I always like asking those OGs what it was like trying to get a wave out there, because on the videos, and I remember when we were watching it live from the cliff, there was every single wave. There's like a dozen teams trying to get on these things, and they were like bumping jet skis. It's similar to how Nazare is now. And we're really grateful. We're really grateful it isn't like that anymore, and hopefully it will never be like that again, because it was just psycho chaos. But
paddling, the paddle movement. Thank you, Ian Walsh, Shane Dorian, Yuri Soledad. You know, a handful of these guys that brought paddling to Pe'ahi. I mean, Laird, and I know some of those guys actually were paddling it, but they were just super low key about it because they didn't want to give up these smaller epic days. But it was the one that broke the glass ceiling was Shane, right? When he paddled into that giant, it was a 25 footer. It was the first time he had ever used the inflation vest, which he had invented because when he was at Mavericks before, he had a 2-wave hold down and he almost drowned. And luckily in that cold water environment, you have a 5mm wetsuit, and that actually floats a lot. It's basically like a flotation device, borderline, but it's still not enough in a dense amount of water. And at Mavericks, where it has those ledges and you have faster moving water over slower moving water, and it creates like a ceiling and you can't punch through swimming up. But when you have an airbag, you're basically a cork and you can come right up. And he got that idea from just, you know, the life-saving devices underneath the airplane seat. And I actually heard after he had, you know, made his own, a bunch of people were stealing them, which is a federal offense off of a plane. It wasn't Shane that was, but I heard a bunch of big wave surfers would go on airplanes and fully take them from underneath, and it's literally a federal offense. But because they thought, oh my gosh, I want the cartridges, you know, that goes with it. But those are unique to the airplane ones, and it's just the time. You could probably use those and just wear it under a wetsuit, probably work.
It's true.
But so, you know, full wraparound circle, you know, it was the paddling that killed towing surfing out there, and all those towing surfers had no home, and their new home was eventually found over in Nazare, which is the most ideal place for towing surfing. Guys have paddled it, of course. There's been paddle events out at Nazare. We've talked about that before, but it is a towing surfing spot, and there's multiple waves. There's, you know, the big left, the big mama out the side, which is a right, 1.5 peak, which is a right, and then you have, you know, second peak, which is a right and a left, and then if it's really crowded, you could go third peak. It's not as crazy as the other ones, but it's still a giant wave, so there's a lot of room. Even if it's crowded, you can kind of get lucky and find a corner. Jaws is a perfect big wave. It's a reef. It breaks pretty much in the same spot every single time. And so now you have 60 jet skis going for a 2-wave set, and there's 30-minute waits in between. And it can be really, really frustrating and a nightmare because you've put all your time into paddling, doing every sport, and then somebody on a overpowered machine comes up and wants to go around you. And at this point, when it happens to us, I just tell you, Ridge, if you're telling me, I'm like, just go, because I'm faster than them and I go deeper anyway. So worst comes to worst, I'll just work around them. I'll use them as a jib or something.
Yeah, and that's a good segue to the paddle era, and that's kind of when you were getting into it. But maybe tell
it was the worst timing. Let me tell you, it was the worst timing to get into surfing Jaws. And maybe before we talk about that, there's like a discrepancy in the name. This place, we love to call it Jaws because we grew up hearing about it being called Jaws. The land surrounding the spot is called Pe'ahi. And Pe'ahi means the beacon or to be called. And I think it was mainly National Geographic. It was maybe the mainstream attention. It was the Strapped crew having this really hyped name, calling it Jaws. It is Jaws to me because it is one of the gnarliest waves on Earth. And if the Jaws shark was a wave, it would be our wave Jaws. But Pe'ahi is the Hawaiian name for it. And Pe'ahi means the beacon or to be called. And it's true. It's called people from around the world. It's called us. And do you answer the call? Do you go for it? I think there's a real spiritual aspect to that place. The place feels alive and it feels like there's a guiding force out there. And it's a place that's notorious for dishing out the worst wipeouts of your life, but then also giving you the best moments, the best rides of your life. And it could be back to back. You could get the best wave of your life and immediately after get the worst experience of your life. And that's why I think we call her she out of respect. And that's like in a Hawaiian culture sense. She, Pe'ahi, is the ultimate teacher.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing I wanted to touch on too, is like when you go out there, the wave has aura unlike any other wave I've been to. Maybe it's just because we grew up sort of it being this mythological place, but it really does feel like that with the huge mountain, the valley going down. There's a jungle right there, the river, and it's just the most perfect, beautiful wave, but it's also terrifying. So that's what I want to get into because I remember my first time going out on the ski, not surfing it, but I think it was maybe 2008, one of those really big swells, and you were just starting to surf it. And I remember you brought me, like I was 13, 12 years old at the time, and you brought me on the ski with you and you took me to the takeoff spot, like the peak. And before that, I'd only been in like 5-foot waves. You know, I'm a kid. And I remember looking down 50 feet of vertical water and just like, I don't know if you remember this, but I was like shaking.
I remember it.
Like physically shaking.
Yeah.
I was so rattled. There's nothing like it in the world. And that was sort of my first experience out there. And I truly like understood the power of it. In that moment, I was like, I'm never going to surf this wave. And it took me a lot of years to sort of get over that initial shock I had on that day. But it'd be interesting to know what your very first impression was of it, like on your first day.
Well, so the first time I actually got to go out there, I would say my era coming up, yours a little bit, but especially mine, because I'm 4.5 years, almost 5 years older than you. It was, I had such a great respect, and I was taught by my dad, our dad, and by who I considered mentors, the Strap crew. And that's the funny thing is like, how much of a mentors were they? I think when you're someone in their position, you don't necessarily have to spend all this time with someone to leave such an indelible mark. Simply saying hi, acknowledging them, referencing what a great ride they may have had on a particular day. I mean, those were the type of things that I would get from, say, a Dave Kalama or a Laird or even Robbie Nash, and it was just like those little things, like in my own head, I realize this now that I'm 30, in my own head, I always thought that they were like more of my mentors or closer with me than we really were, And I think maybe every kid sort of feels that way when you get to just interact and spend even some time, because we could go to Ho'okipa on any given day back then, especially, and you would see one of those guys there, and you're just showing up to the same place that they are. You're not necessarily meeting up, but in your own head, it feels like their mentorship. So that level of respect for them, I could probably have gone out to Jaws earlier, and a few kids at the time that I knew, like Sean and DK Walsh, his brother Ian Walsh had been already out there for some time. They went out when they were like 14. It was Albie Lair and, Marlon Lewis, Billy Kemper. Those guys were already kind of going out there on their own. I just felt like I couldn't go out there until I was given the rite of passage. Like I deserved to go out there, earned it. And sure enough, it happened. One day we were going to Anthony's with, some friends that were from the mainland. We were going just to, get some food. It was a decent, nice day. And then get a call from Dave Kalama, 16 years old. And he's like, hey, Laird and I are going up to Pe'ahi, Jaws, to go foiling. This is back when foiling was snowboard boots, aluminum air chair foil. And they used to, actually Dave Kalama's father, Elima, 100% Hawaiian, by the way. This is the craziest thing. He's 100% Hawaiian, lived right on the beach at Baldwin. And that's where those guys would launch all of their skis. And they basically said, bring your dad's jet ski, come up. And so my dad, I don't think he really wanted to go. Our dad, he didn't really want to go with me because I think he was a bit nervous about it. So he sent, our Hanai uncle, Barkley Bastion. So he was kind of like, went with me on, our dad's jet ski, Yamaha 800cc. It was probably like 100 horsepower or something, maybe even less. It was not much back then. But so we meet them there, and it was like living the Laird movies. It was living Strapped movies. It was like, I was like all of a sudden in VR. I didn't know what VR was back then, but basically I've been doing some foiling. I've been doing it since I was 9. So I had some experience, quite a bit of experience, but when snowboard boots hit salt water, the soles will dissolve over time. And we're going to get to this part of the story in a little bit. But so basically I had borrowed my mom's, I think it was either my mom's, no, it was my dad's snowboard boot, our dad's snowboard boots that were meant for the hydrofoil. And they were probably a size 11. And I was maybe a size 8 at the time. And so it was just, I was floating in them, obviously. Maybe a size 9. I'm not sure how big I was at 16. I was still pretty small. Anyway, we start going up. There's no one up at Pe'ahi. I mean, back then, no one would go up on these small swells. It had to be like gargantuan, right? And it's just us up there. Laird and Dave go up together. I'm with Barkley. We get up to there. Those guys foil for probably 2 hours, and we just watch. And, Laird's going on the lefts with his arms spread, just flying, raw, and it's just like he's hugging a bear. It's just crazy. It's so it's so cinematic. It's so godly. And then Dave, he's going on a lot of lefts. He's going rights, and he has a little more tucked knee, approach, and he's doing similar bear hugs and big, Laird style lines. Those guys were the best at foiling, next to Rush at that very time. And then they come up and they're like, okay, it's your turn. And it was just like in that deep voice, right? And I'm like, okay, here we go. And I was kind of nervous because, you all of a sudden arrive at a place that you've been working so hard to get to your whole life, And there was this moment where I looked up at the cliff and I was like, I can't believe I'm down here right now. And also, I wish I was still up there. Like, I feel like it has happened so much, so quick. But when you're a little kid and you're looking down, there's nothing more than you want to just be down there. But then you got to be careful what you wish for, because that was that moment where, oh gosh, how did I get myself into this mess? And so I borrowed Dave's board. It had these cool flames on a yellow board. Eric Ader took the only photos of me when I was out there. No one filmed this day. And so Laird decided to sit, or like stay on the side, and Dave was towing. He was gonna tow me. I wasn't ready for Laird to tow me yet. And then, so I got on Dave's board. I get towed out of the water. All of a sudden, my feet feel loose, like looser than they are when you have an 8-foot, like an 8 size shoe and an 11. I was like, gosh, something doesn't feel right. All of a sudden, I feel the soles of both the snowboard boots, because of the salt eating away at them, lift up. There were these K2 snowboard boots, black and red, and they just lifted up. And I was still foiling though. Like, I was still riding the foil, but now I was going to get towed into maybe a 15-foot Hawaiian wave, which, is like a 30-foot faced wave out at Pe'ahi on a foil where you're literally like should be attached, because back then the foils were so hard to ride without snowboard boots, the leverage. We wore snowboard boots because the leverage on the foil, because the aluminum, and it was thought that's what you needed. Now we know you can just strapless it. Anyway, all of a sudden I just let go of the rope, because I'm like, I don't want to get towed in on this giant wave with a foil in my boots. And then the look of disgust on Dave's face as he turned around, the eye roll was like, what have I done taking this kid out here? You can't even foil in a straight line. He comes up and he's like, are you good? This is the real deal, son. We're at Pe'ahi. We're at Jaws. Like, he didn't say that, but that was the energy, right? And then I didn't have words to say. So all I did was lift my foot up, and you could see the bottoms of my feet because the sole was gone. And then he just started cracking up in laughter. And then he thought it was so funny. I ended up hopping on his jet ski and taking the snowboard boots off. He gave me his, which was even more of a rites of passage because I was literally stepping into his shoes. I was walking literally in his footsteps. Now I had to go ride the wave. So they towed me on to a couple shoulders, and, I was doing, the big arm spread for stability. And there's a trick to big wave surfing. I was actually talking a little divergent here. I met Andy Anderson, who's this insane street skateboarder and freestyle skater. Incredible. I met him in France randomly because he was there. He was one of the sponsors who were supporting that Quicksilver Festival I did. But we were talking about hands and kung fu, because in his skating, where he places his hands will give him either more pop or more control through his ankles, which is really crazy. And surfing is very much like that. I was always told by Laird and Dave and the strap crews, like, the bigger the wave gets, the more uncomfortable you get. Spread your fingers wide and stiffen them as much as you can, and that gives your body this rigidity. And so that's why you see Laird and, even Dave on these giant waves, their hands are really spread wide and their arms are out. That's like a stability thing. So I was doing that, and then I got towed into one wave, and it ended up being like, it kind of closed out around me. And the foil's nice because you can go way to the flats and outrun whitewater if you're in the right enough spot, if it doesn't shoot out behind you. And there's one of those things that shot out behind me, and it enveloped me. And I think I would have broken both my knees because I was this 16-year-old, but I was pretty short. I think I was probably 5'4" still, maybe even shorter. And I think my knees would have just blown out. I would have just been noodles attached to this snowboard boots too. And we had a quick release, but you don't want to let go of it because the foil will come out and stab you, an aluminum katana blade. But I made it out. I could remember kicking out right before the rocks, and then Dave comes up and Laird's trailing behind on the other jet ski, and he's like, "Wow, you're so lucky you didn't fall." And I'm like, "Oh, would that have been bad?" And he's like, "You would have felt that one. You would have felt it." And so that was the day. That was my first experience out at Pe'ahi ever, and it was like the beginning. It was the beginning. It was after that I knew I already knew that's what I wanted to do, but it was like, okay, I'm actually arriving. I'm here. And then we had another swell, not too long after, where Laird got to tow me in, and I was just trying to emulate Laird the best I could. Jerry Lopez had shaped me a tow board with Laird's tiger shark pattern, which was a yellow board and red stripes, like tiger stripes. And, I was sponsored by Oxbow at the time, so I had to just hold my hands out wide and just, try to be mini Laird. Like, that was my MO, right? And so he towed me in. It was after watching 2 days of him and Dave and Derek and absolutely dominate out there. And then full circle, my turn came, and we made, I got to be in a movie with Laird. It was one that was produced by Oxbow at the time, but it was I was still part of, a Laird movie. And so it was the comfort level was so there. It was wow, okay, I windsurfing, I don't mind speed. I'm doing turns. I'm turning more than these older guys that are veterans out here, not out surfing the strap crew guys yet, but I'm definitely better than most of these other guys because I understand speed. I understand straps. I understand how to bottom turn because of all my windsurfing and kiting up to that point. I think I was 17 at the time. And then it was a year goes by, and then all of a sudden, newsflash, we're paddling surfing. And that's when another god showed up. It was Shane Dorian. Shane Dorian arrived, and the North Shore, being close to Maui, right, seemed a million miles away from Maui. It's a different universe, right? And of course, you and I grew up watching the Kelly and Andy show. We knew of all those legends, but it was another fantasy land. It was a different world, and because we weren't a part of it necessarily, we were part of this other world. But so when he arrived, it was just another god showing up. It was whoa. And I got sponsored by the sunscreen brand Vertra, and Shane Dorian was part sponsor, and there was murmurs that people were going to be paddling Jaws and no toe windsurfing was going to be allowed. Do you remember this time, Ridge?
Yeah. It was like 2011.
Yeah, 11.
Was that the year? Yeah.
Because I had my like breakout really good toe session with Laird in 2009. It was after like the swell of the year, and it was on the smaller decline side of the swell, but I still like I had a big performance and people were talking. My sponsors cared. It was really cool. It was like I was literally stepping into those guys' shoes, even if they were too big for me to ever fit, you know? And so that was the rude awakening, was that it was like, because I'd always been a fan of the Eddie Cow, but up to that point, paddle and surfing only existed at Waimea Bay. And of course it existed in more places, but really in the surfing realm, it was, you know, the industry, what we got to see on magazines and videos, it was Waimea Bay and it was Mavericks. And Mavericks was too crazy for anyone up at that point. You know, like people were drowning actually. And Shane Dorian almost died. And, you know, how is that even possible? But anyway, so there was rumors. There was murmurs. Guys have been trying to paddle a little bit, but no one had been like, let's wait for a toe swell and let's go. And this was, I believe, March 15th, 2011. Shane Dorian arrives with a John Carpenter JC big wave gun built unlike anything anyone else had. You know, Waimea guns, Mavericks guns were really thin, really narrow, lots of nose rockered out in the nose, not a lot of tail rocker. Thrusters or tri-fin. The back fin was giant and there was 2 sidebiters in the front. And Shane shows up with this board, the modern big wave gun that all of our guns are similarly based on, right? 10.4, 21 inches wide, 4 inches thick, quads. And he basically, or actually it was not even a 10.4, it was a 10.6. Ian Walsh had his old Waimea gun that he'd used in previous, you know, Eddie invites and all that, whatever he would do out at Waimea Bay, and that's what he was riding. And Ian was psycho because he had board shorts and a wetsuit top on, and not that thick of a leash because those thick leashes didn't actually exist up to that point. Shane showed up with the first version of his Billabong inflation vest, which was just an air bubble on the back and one canister. It was Mustang Survival. They produce a lot of, you know, water safety stuff for boaters and stuff. So they collaborated that. And this was the first time Shane was testing it in real surf, big waves. So I didn't have a big wave gun up to that point. My dream was always being the Eddie, but my quiver back then wasn't the hundreds boards I have now. It was like I had 2 short boards, 1 step up, you know, 3 stand-up paddle boards because I was like doing stand-up paddle competitions, right? But I went up to Nash and I was able to finagle getting a 9'8", 28 wide, 4-inch thick sup gun, which was made for Robbie Nash. Thruster, tri-fin actually. And you know, the board actually went really good, like for what it was. Like I had for the longest time the craziest airdrop I'd ever had. But I remember there wasn't a lot of support. I couldn't at this point, now that I was, you know, Laird and those guys were stepping away from Pe'ahi, Jaws, it was like a new era. It just felt different. It was something had changed. It was like those guys had done their thing for the last 20 years, right? And I showed up on a boat that that was our neighbor, Matt Smith, on his fishing boat. And no one would do water safety for me. Everyone we asked said, no, decline. And the only person that said yes was Victor Lopez, who is Jerry Lopez's younger brother. Also one of, you know, the legends of Maui and one of the early guys out at Pe'ahi. Who's the only guy that said yes. And fortunately, you know, through my sponsorship at Red Bull and, you know, the money that I'd saved up, I was able to get a jet ski and, you know, wrap it like a Red Bull can, and it was rad. So I bought it and then had them wrap it, and it was pretty rad. But so that was my water safety, and I could remember just me and Dad sitting on the back of the boat, and he's like, you can do this, you got this. And it was like starting from scratch, zero. Tow and surfing was so different. You could avoid being at the most critical spot, getting caught inside. You could avoid all that. And here I was having to paddle out, and the only guys who were out there were the best of the best. And there was like maybe 5 or 6 of them. It was, rest in peace, Sion Milowski, but it was Ian Walsh, Yuri Soledad, Danilo Couto, Shane, and I think that was pretty much it. Like it was just the heavies, right, from North Shore. So paddled out there on my sup. At that time, you'd get yelled at for riding a sup anywhere, even if you're a mile away. Like I was, I could remember being harassed by people like that. So I was like, oh, I don't know. I hope one of my heroes, one of the gods, Shane Dorian, doesn't yell at me for being on a sup out here. But it was the only gun I had, right? And first thing he did, he's paddled up and he's like, hey, Kai, I've heard all about you. So stoked you're on the Vertra team. Good luck out here. And he just paddled away, and he paddled 100 yards farther
sick.
out and deeper. And I was like, wow, Shane's the coolest guy ever. Like, he's just so nice and just such a badass, like real mountain man. He hunts in the mountains and then he rides mountains, liquid mountains. So anyway, he goes out the back, waits 5.5 hours. Everyone's getting small ones on the inside. And I remember just watching him paddle. I hadn't caught in a wave to that point. It was really windy, 25 knots up to that point, and I would like look at it and get blown out the back. Because I was on a sup too. You can kind of get blown around. Shane paddles for this wave, and it won him biggest barrel of the year, ride of the year, performance of the year, all in one wave. He didn't even make it, but he proved to the world what was possible. Paddled into 25-footer, packed the barrel. The thing spat so hard it vaporized him. And I could remember watching him as I went over the side. I could watch him like drop in and pull up under. And then, it just looked like death. It looked like death, like he was going to die. And then all of a sudden, I started counting because I knew he had this inflation device, right? And so I started counting 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, 4, 1,000, 5, 1,000, 6, 1,000. And he pops up. He should have been under for like a minute, especially being attached to a 10'6" board with, no flotation. You get dragged and you can be held under for sure a minute easy, even before getting a second wave on the head, because you just get dragged to the rocks. He popped straight up right where he fell in the barrel, because when you fall in those barrels, it's either going to be the worst wipeout. If you go over kind of early, it'll drag you in that cycle. But if you like fall late enough where the shockwave's already traveling so far up the barrel, if you fall into, there's a hole kind of here. If you fall into that, the wave will shoot you out the back. And that's literally what happened to him. And his ski came in, picked him up. He went to the boat, changed the cartridge on his back, and paddled back out. And it was like, whoa, the sport has been changed forever again. And then the next swell, October, was it the 7th, maybe 6th, 7th? Actually, this time.
Yeah.
Right? It was this time.
Yeah, it was super early October.
It was 2012. So it was a whole year later. There hadn't been anything the whole next winter, like end of 2011, early 2012. End of 2012, there was the swell, and it was 60 people showed up paddling. And it was all the heaviest surfers you ever knew. I mean, there was guys like Bruce Irons paddling out. There was like, Dusty Payne. There was all the CT, some heavy CT guys at the time. Dave Wassel ended up winning some crazy monster paddle award, and then, on and on, right? And so,
and that was the first like glassy day too, that they really had the chance, like a big glassy day. That was,
and it still had paddled, wind, right?
A little bit. The first day, because I remember watching the first day, the first half of the day was pretty light wind, and then the whole next day was windy, but they were still paddling. But yeah, that first day was giant. And there was 50 people paddling.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's the thing. In 2012, it was the afternoon, that legendary clip that was shot by Elliot LeBeau, ACL Cinema, of Shane redefining the sport again. So you had all the best guys come out, right? And guys were getting insane rides, already like unquestionably the best rides ever ridden in big wave paddle surfing. Like the door had been blown wide open by Shane. Come that afternoon, and there's a funny video of me like narrating it from the channel with a bowl cut, where he drops into this 25-foot wave, 50-foot faced wave, arguably, and backdoors it and puts his hands up, and he's in this giant barrel and his hands are spread wide and he gets spit out of the channel. You could hear the screaming from the cliff. It was like everyone had, okay, Shane put the level here and then everyone else took it to there on this day. And then Shane went whack way to the top. Still one of the greatest rides ever out at Pe'ahi by today's paddling standards, for sure. And he did it again. And it was just this, it was the perfect conditions. And it felt like in the entire universe, that was the place to be. As if a surfer, a big wave rider, in that moment, you were in the right place at the right time to witness some historical thing. That's how it felt. And that's when I'd gotten my first gun. It was a 10-foot board. I got my first real good paddling wave, prone. And then the door was open. I got a little head cover up. I was mainly surfing the West Bowl. I wasn't dabbling on the North Peak where Shane and Ian and a lot of the heavies were sitting. I was like much wider, which now looking back on it, it's arguably just as hard, maybe sometimes harder, because the West Peak sucks up so vertically that it ends up being like a backdoor takeoff where you can get an actual chip on the North Peak. The scary thing about the North Peak is a little easier to get caught inside. And then on top of that, you have to, you're farther away from water safety. Everyone seems like a million miles, so you feel much more alone. You feel isolated out there. West Peak, you're closer to the channel, but it's still like, anyway, that's just the perspective on it. Actually, going back to when Shane caught his wave, when I caught my sup wave, that was still one of the craziest up to that point, even for many years, one of the biggest waves I'd ever paddled in out there. Maybe it was a 20-footer, like maybe a 40-foot face or something. But I never felt speed like that on a board like that, And I was just like, the fins were humming and I made it to channel. I remember like how you felt that one time on the back of the jet ski, shaking like nervously. I was loose, like my legs, I was noodles. And I remember paddling back to the boat and my dad was like so proud. He's like, yeah, that was amazing. Our dad was so proud. He was like so psyched and he's like, okay, go do it again. Get back out there. It looks like you're having so much fun. And I remember like, I don't want to go back out. I just got one. I'm good. And then so of course I went back out and I got a couple smaller ones, but I didn't even get close to how gnarly. It was really Yuri Soledad, I think, that helped me over the ledge on that one, because he was paddling out and he yelled "Go, Kai!" And it's amazing what someone telling you to go can make you do.
Yeah, and I remember I was watching all these sessions and after I had that experience, it was around that time I think when you took me out and I was just petrified. And you're saying, yeah, this is where we sit and this is where we paddle. And it was like the towing thing was scary enough. And then when paddling came, it was just like unfathomably scary. And that was kind of the time that I started, going off to college or high school, then college. And then I remember one year I had come back from college. It was like 2017 at this point. And you've been paddling and towing Jaws for years at this point. And I was pretty apprehensive of doing it. And I was starting to surf bigger waves. Like my friend Marco and we'd paddle out to the outer reefs by ourselves. And I was sort of getting my foot in the door, but it was still like paddling Jaws was such another level. And I remember there was this one swell that it was kind of smaller and windy and no one was going up there for some reason. I think maybe like the week before there was a big swell, so everyone was blown out. And you were like, okay, we're going to go out and I think you kind of almost like lured me into it and be like, oh yeah, you won't like catch any waves, but you'll just come out and cruise. And I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm down.
That's the greatest trick, is to get people to go out there and be like, oh, just come out in the channel. Like, you don't have to catch a wave, just sit. And then once you're out there, you're like, hey, just catch one. Just catch one. We'll just catch a shoulder. Yeah. And then they catch one little one. You're like, no, one more. And then you go deeper and you get on a bigger wave and you're like, hey, here, just take my paddling gun real quick.
Yeah. So essentially that was what happened. So we were up there and it was still big. Like it was still like, there's still 20 footers coming in. And I was having a great time watching you, not even thinking about it. And next thing I know, you're giving me a vest to put on. And it was like, a dad was like, oh yeah, go for it. And you're like, yeah, it's easy. Just go out there. Like you were so desensitized. Like this is a relatively small wave and we were towing. I think I gotten
really pounded up to that point. I gotten like, once you start, it was the session that I got towed in by Dave Kalama on the left at Jaws at one point, and it was the first wipeout I ever had at Pe'ahi. And the difference between your first wipeout to a wipeout now, still scary, but the first time, you can attest to this, it literally feels like you're going to die. I was 17 and I was underwater and I opened my eyes, which I'll never do again, and you saw these thunder clouds, lightning clouds just turning, oscillating so fast, and you were all of a sudden under 50 feet of water because the wave passed over you, and it was like the wipeout's so violent, it feels like a rag doll, and everything, you can't feel anymore because it just turns to static. That's how violent it is, right? And I remember my first wipeout was saying, okay, this is the end of my life. I'm done. This is over. Like, I've died.
So you...
Like, whatever.
But
then up to that point, right? Then when I got to you...
Yeah, you've had all this experience, almost 10 years out there before.
When I got to you, I was like, I'd already been through, done that. And you hadn't.
No, so I was going in fresh. I was terrified. And I was like,
fresh
okay,
meat.
I'm just going to like turn off my brain. Like this, I knew this was coming at some point in my life with you have been done it for so long. And I'm kind of moving in that direction. And I remember we went out there and I was like, please just get me on a wave right away. Like, I just want to let go of the rope and just get this first wave over with. And I remember we were sitting out there, and of course this happens like all the time where it's firing. You get out there and you're all nervous and really want to catch one. It just goes flat. And we're sitting there for like half an hour. I'm just like the nervousness in me is just stewing. And I'm like, I can't do this. It's
out here.
It's over. And then finally like a bomb came. It was like one of the bigger ones that afternoon. And I remember you were towing me in and it felt like I was so deep. And even looking at the footage now, it was pretty deep. And that's like where you want to be, And
well, so when I tow people in, it's like, just hold your line. You're going to, there's two options here. If you just hold your line and don't move, you're going to ride either in the pocket or in the barrel all the way to the channel. Best ride of your life, greatest photo, yada, yada. If you hesitate and you get scared and you try to straighten out, it'll be the worst wipeout of your entire life. I'm not saying I do this every time, but I like telling people that before because I'm like, just trust me. You're on the best board in the world. I'm going to tow you into the perfect spot. Ridge. You just got to hold your line. Just don't move. Don't move.
But that's the thing. That's the thing that you're assuming that I was at the similar skill level as you. And
you were, though. Look at you now. It was always in you.
So I guess that's how like
I saw you in the future. I just was trying to like fast track you. Like, come on. You I already went through this. I'm going to help you skip some steps here. Bop.
But that was the thing. So it was paddling had already been established. And it was like, and I understand this now, and I'm sure it was like this for you, is that it was almost embarrassing if you rode the wave in the same way that you paddle it. You want to take off deep. You want to be barely making it, doing turns, getting barreled. Like, that's just the standard for towing. Like, if you're riding the shoulder, like, why do it? It's just pointless. So that was the mentality I think you had when I'm towing into my very first wave. And I let go, and the things just like, that's the thing about Jaws. And watching from the cliff, maybe I never had that sort of perspective, but the way that wave breaks is when you're towing in on the North Peak, it looks like a big straight wall. And then as you get into the wave, the thing compresses and the West Bull comes at you. But when you're first letting go of the rope, and I had no idea, this is my first wave and this is a 20 footer, it was feathering 100 yards down the line. I'm like, cannot be happening. Like, this is my first wave and I'm about to have to straighten out or pull into a straight closeout and I'm going to die. Like, this is so much bigger than anything I'd ridden. And I just sort of
like
had to turn
bigger,
that,
right?
Yeah, leagues bigger. It's like
Jaws is on a complete different level.
Yeah,
like 10 times heavier than anywhere else, anywhere.
Yeah, the 8-foot Hawaiian outer Sprex I was surfing before just doesn't compare. Like, it's not the same league. There's no other wave on the island that can compare. So
anywhere, I think in Hawaii, nowhere compares when it's on that level. There's nowhere that's close, and it's a leap of faith. It's like, okay, I'm really stepping up here.
And that was like my first lesson. It's like, I saw that wall and that feathering super far down the line. I was like, I have to turn my brain off and just surf how I know how to surf. And I have to go high and get speed. And I remember I just did a huge high line, and then all that speed carried me around. The West Bowl compressed and I made it pretty fine. Like, nowadays I could be on that same wave, and because I know the drill a little bit more, it wouldn't be scary at all. But yeah, so after that first wave, I was like, that was the biggest turning point in my entire life, because I went right before it, I was like, I'm over this. I'm like, this isn't for me. And then after that wave, it was like, I was addicted, and I was like, I want to do this for as long as I possibly can. I want to learn the ropes. And that was huge. Same. And then I remember, I think I went back to school. So it was a couple more years before I surfed Jaws again. And my first paddle day, that was like that whole experience relived again, because obviously paddling is terrifying. And it was a pretty relatively small day, but still, 15, occasional 20 footer. I don't know if you remember that day. It was a really glassy day, and I was riding I think you gave me an 8.6 Channel Islands, one of your old yellow boards, which is pretty
was fun.
Small. Yeah, it was a 6 board.
Kelly
It was pretty
Slater
small
developed.
though.
Small for
Yeah, it was, like,
Pe'ahi
really flat.
if you're not, well, that board wasn't made for Pe'ahi. It was made for like Waimea, it wasn't made for Pe'ahi. There was a lot of good in that board, and it could handle a place like Waimea, but as soon as you'd paddle out to Pe'ahi, it didn't have enough tail rocker. It had too much V, which Chop doesn't particularly like on a big board. Could have used a little more entry rocker. It obviously could have been a little bit longer, but yeah, that was my first time trying to paddling, and it was a really similar thing to when I first towed, in that you were like, oh, it's small, just like go out there and get a couple, and Dad was saying the same thing, as he was desensitized too, and I'm pretty sure Mom was saying the same thing, because they've been watching, Rich, and it was like, it was so normal. I'm like, are you guys crazy? Like, this is psycho. Like, aren't you a little bit worried about this? And they're just like, oh yeah, go out there. So this day, luckily, it was you just didn't have enough confidence in yourself.
I didn't have all the self-confidence, yeah.
But we all saw I think it, so you were like, oh,
I think you were getting some tow waves that morning, and I remember I was sitting with Ian Walsh, and I feel like when you were telling that story with Shane, it was a really similar thing where it was basically just me and Ian, because it was pretty early in the morning.
You have a lot of moments with you and Ian, just you and Ian.
Yeah.
So sick.
Yeah, and it was just us two, and I was out there for maybe 5 minutes, and like a big peak comes, and I think he had caught in wave before, and he just looks at me and he's like, oh, are you going? And then I was just like, oh crap, like I have to go. Like
if Ian
you just
Walsh
have to turn
says
around
to
and
go, you have to go.
And that's the thing with paddling, for those that don't know, is it looks so steep and so intimidating. Like, if you don't have any other experience surfing, pretty much any other wave, there's no other wave I've ever surfed that's like this, where it looks so steep and the waves coming in so fast, and you just have to throw away everything you thought you knew about paddling into big waves and just turn around and try to paddle as early as possible. I was like paddling mid-face on this thing, and still the thing, by the time I stood up, it drew me so far up, and it was so vertical. And I just dropped in, and I could just see the nose catch, because it was such a flat rockered board.
Oh wait, did you fall on that one?
No, the nose touched the water, but luckily the spray flew in my face, and I didn't fall, and I just had the steepest drop ever. And it was one of those that didn't have a huge wall. It was pretty much just like a big explosion, and it was like the same thing where I was like popped out, somehow made it, did not think I was gonna make it, and then. Again, now it's like you get a little bit more comfortable and desensitized. That wouldn't be that crazy of a wave now for me, but those first waves out there, so similar to your experience. It's just like, you don't think it's possible, and then it somehow works out, and then that's sort of your new baseline. And then you kind of over the next few years, you try to get that same feeling where you push it a little bit harder to get that sort of feeling again, and it eventually ends up with you just getting freaking smoked, and that's definitely happened to both of us a lot of times.
Yeah, you could go 10 years of tow and surfing out there and never fall. Paddling, it's really hard to even go one session without finding yourself in some consequential position, whether it's falling on a wave or whether it's just being caught inside. It's there's just so much to dive into on that side, and I feel like we're only scratching the surface. But, I think this was a good, part one to probably lots of parts for Pe'ahi, Jaws, because there's so much lore. This is the lore of this place is just remarkable. And it's always those funny little stories that, you don't think about all that often that are the most memorable in a way, they're the most defining, maybe is the right word.
Yeah, I think we covered the good origin story of how we sort of got into it. And there's definitely a heck of a lot more crazy stories we've had in the years since. But so we'll definitely, like you said, have to come.
As a sneak peek, we'll definitely in the next one discuss the first people to properly ride Pe'ahi on any craft on a big day. And then, there's even weird instances of how many different crafts can you ride, including riding the rapids in the river on an inflatable board into the wave. Yeah, we'll discuss that at length a little bit more
Yeah.
later. So, but yeah, right on. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Bridge, I can't wait to hear more about now that we're moving into your era out there. It's going to be fun to dive in a little bit more in your experiences, and yeah, there's lots to discuss.